Hello everyone, and welcome to this XpoNorth session on design, lifestyle and wellbeing. My name is Irene McCara-McWilliam. I'm Deputy Director, Research and Innovation at the Glasgow School of Art and Director of our Highlands and Islands campus in Murray, which you can see in the background in this image. I'm your facilitator for this event, and we have three fantastic panelists to discuss design for wellbeing. So I'd like to introduce Sarah Drummond. Give us a wave, Sarah. Thank you. Sarah Drummond, service designer and co-founder of Snook Service Design Consultancy. Karen Anderson, who's architect and founding partner of Anderson, Bell and Christie, and also visiting professor at the Scott Sutherland School of Architecture and Built Environment at Robert Gordon's University in Aberdeen. And Nicole Ruillac, industrial designer, founder and creative director of Level in San Francisco. So welcome to three panelists, and thank you very much for joining us today. And thanks to all of the audience who are participating in this event. Sarah, Karen and Nicole will talk today about their experience in design for wellbeing. And I've invited them, should they wish, to post links to projects or other references in the chat space so that you can look up more about their work. So we'll kick off. May I first ask you to introduce yourselves and say something about your work? So perhaps I can start with Sarah. Would you like to tell us about yourself and some of your work, please?
Yeah, thanks, Irene. Well, hi, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. So as Irene said, my name's Sarah, and I, for the last 12 years, co-founded and was the CEO of a design studio called Snook. Predominantly, we worked on designing services, but really at the core of our practice was the approach of co-designing with the people who will use the product or service. When we started out, I think it would be fair to say, and Irene can probably nod to this because she's been working on this for far longer than I have, but the inclusion of people in the design of products and services, particularly government and public sector level, was not the everyday. And I guess I've worked quite hard for the last 12 years to help build the industry up across the UK around that inclusion. So that's a really big part of my work. And with that, which I know we're going to talk about today, comes the discussion around inclusion and accessibility of products and services. So that's a kind of thing I'm really passionate about when it comes to my work. Right now, I'm actually making a film, which is not for today's discussion, but I'm taking a bit of a break from running a design studio. But I'm really passionate about co-design, inclusion and accessibility. And we've done a whole host of work, which I'll talk a bit about today, in kind of wellbeing and health space, working with some of the biggest bodies in the UK, like NHS Digital, and a lot of charities that focus on things like not just physical health, but mental health as well. So I'll pause there and hand over to the next person.
Thanks very much, Sarah. Karen, can I introduce you?
Yes, certainly. I think there's a very strong linkage between all of us today, and leading on from that is this idea of community and participation and inclusion and empowerment. And that was the basis of the start of my practice back in the 90s, when I was involved in some of the earliest community participation regeneration in the physical estates around Glasgow. So that's where I came from, working very much with a number of community activists who really wanted to see change in their housing and the quality of their places. And that's something that, again, I began to build on, working on sort of place design as well, urban design and urban regeneration throughout my working. Looking at rural areas as well as urban areas. I also got involved, it was a sort of, incrementally in community buildings and in community health buildings and education buildings. So all of it underpinned by the importance of involving people in the design of where they will live and where they will work and play, hopefully. So very much following on Snook's practice as well. At this moment in time, I'm working with students and I'm finding this absolutely brilliant. I'm working in sustainable design proposals for the Western Isles, which have issues of community, which are very, very strong and very important actually in these days. And as such, I'm finding it a really inspiring. Irene is going to ask us also about our future thoughts, but I'm finding that that's really helped me to actually come to terms with how we actually go forward, and that'll be something we'll talk about later. So thank you.
Thanks very much, Karen. Nicole, may I invite you to say something about yourself and your work?
Thanks, Irene. I'm really excited to be here with all these incredibly talented ladies on the panel today. So my background is being in industrial design in San Francisco. I've been educated here and spent the last 20 years of my life in and around Silicon Valley. And, having grown up in the innovation hub, bringing a lot of new to the world technologies to people, about 5 years back, I decided to start my own studio for a number of reasons, but partly because I really wanted to be able to focus my career on doing design for good. So since starting that, there's a broad spectrum of good, but right now we're working on a lot of projects that are addressing sustainability, how to reduce consumer waste, a lot of projects with accessibility, inclusivity, designing for people with disabilities. That's really great for my heart and soul and the kind of work that I want to do. Helping people that have often been overlooked and under-considered in the world of design. In addition to that, we've worked with a lot of medical technology companies that are bringing new innovations and algorithms to people so they can access healthcare, monitor their health and conditions with their doctors, but remotely anywhere in the world where they have a Wi-Fi signal, so they can, see what's happening with their heart, what's happening inside of their bodies in totally new ways. And I'm really excited to bring that, accessibility of healthcare to many people. And beyond that, I've also spent a lot of my career working in health and wellness, kind of starting in the early days. I worked on the very first Fitbit and some early wearable technologies, and then I continued on in that space in fitness, and in-home fitness has been really big during the pandemic. So we've done a lot there, and have really just tried to dedicate my career to and the work that we do at the studio to bringing, some good to the future of the planet, the future of humanity and society. And happy to be a part of this discussion.
That's fantastic. All of everything that I've heard, because what you've all described is really a values-based approach to design, and really your phrase to call heart and soul in what you're doing, and you're all talking about putting your heart and soul into your work. So that's really a strong part that's come out so far. So in that context, given the last 2 or 3 years, certainly the last 2 years, can you say something about design in the context of what we've just been through and what we might have learned from that in relation to what you've been saying, and what we might do as designers to affect positive change in the future? And you've already given some indicators of that in terms of what you're doing, but just how do we take the learning forward of this particularly difficult period that the whole planet has been through, and turn it into something in which we can program in, as it were, more positive change than might have been the case? I'll just ask for a volunteer. Does anybody want to start on that one? Sarah?
I'm happy to go for it. I actually just met a friend today for the first time in 2.5 years, and we couldn't quite believe how quickly the time had gone. And we're both sort of involved in design, and we were actually chatting about the question you've just asked, is what changed? Like, something seemed to shift in the last 2 years. I've spent like 12 years with Snook, and even prior to that, sort of working in public sector. Irene, as you know, because Irene actually used to teach me, for those listening today, Irene was my boss. And working in government and in public services, where particularly, like, which we'll come on to later on, like health pathways are so important because they're connected to lots of different organizations and bodies, and no one organization owns one person's journey through being well, you know, because wellness is such a kind of holistic thing. But it's been so bloody hard to get things done because of technology and data for so long, and so many excuses that we can't possibly do that, or that's in the next business year cycle, or this is going to happen in 3 years' time, or we procured this platform that will take 5 years to get the data right. And all of these underlying pieces of infrastructure support the services that every citizen, you and I, use every day when it comes to visiting the doctor, you know, getting a health number to get get something done, maybe applying for housing. It's all part of a well-being. And what the pandemic showed us is that we don't need to wait for any of that, because we actually were able to scrabble together services and make them work in less than 2, 3, 4 weeks from local authorities. You know, we had, in the space of 4 weeks in Camden, fantastic work popping up around like kind of community services delivering food parcels to people. They had scanning barcodes ready to go. In less than 6 months, we had a new way to find your National Health Service number, which, for anyone who remembers that, scrabbling around in an old notebook somewhere, not even knowing that number. In less than 3 months, we had a full vaccination service. So I think what the pandemic taught us is that there's really no more excuses or barriers for good design to take place, and that it is possible to make these things happen because we had to. So that's, I think, what really taught me. So I don't take any excuses now when I sit in any meetings and people say, we couldn't, oh no, that's the next year's cycle. I think, well, why not now? Because we did it over the last 2 years. So that's what I learned, is we can do things by stealth. We can do them quickly. Quick is not always better, but we can still do them quickly. And we can get essential services out there when people do need them the most. That's what I learned.
Yeah.
Anybody want to come in on that? That's a good starter, Sarah. Thank you.
Yeah, I think kind of piggybacking off what Sarah said is like the innovation can happen fast. I think sometimes in Silicon Valley, people move too fast and have this kind of like growth at any cost mindset. And I think for me during the pandemic, I really took a look back at like, we have this mentality out here to just like keep growing, to like prove that you're doing good enough and grow as fast as possible, just so that everybody thinks that like you're successful and that's a model of success. And I actually think that sometimes now it's good to reflect on like actually focusing on quality rather than quantity. So I'm thinking about this question more in the context of my studio, but I sort of made the decision during the pandemic that we weren't going to scale anymore, and that we weren't going to hire, so that we could actually really focus on doing quality work, that I can be really involved with clients and really have a great relationship with my team and clients. And so I've spent, the last 2.5 years really focused on a few core clients where I'm working on like health and fitness and medical technologies, and really things that are going to make a difference to people. I'm not really willing to work on just tech for the sake of tech anymore, or doing something that's not actually going to have a positive impact. And so we actually very frequently now turn clients away if I feel like what they're doing is not going to have a positive impact in this world. I'm saying I'm not just going to hire people and, just for the goal of growing my revenue and, making myself feel like I am succeeding in this world. I'm not going to take on projects and work with clients that I don't think have values that are aligned with myself and my team and what we care about. And no more creating junk that's just going to go into the landfill. I think it's really about having more focus on the quality of life and what we want, how we want to impact the planet.
That's great, Karen.
Yeah, just sort of segging into the quality of life and the idea of slow rather than fast that you're talking about, Nicole. I think what was in the world of the concrete world and not the digital one, I think what was really interesting was that the pandemic made everyone think about places and spaces and their homes and their outdoor spaces differently. I mean, again, it's something that as architects and urban designers, we think about all the time. And we're always frustrated, much in the way that Sarah's frustrated, that not enough money is put into the external spaces and the quality of our towns, our neighborhoods. But what became apparent was that those who could, and this was an issue that we've got to think about inequalities here, but those who could spend a lot of money in their homes and their gardens in the pandemic. And where I am in the Highlands, all of a sudden you could not get an architect to design a house or a contractor to extend it, because so many people were making property decisions that they wouldn't have made about a quality of life, being slower in the countryside, being able to zoom into work. So there was a real sort of focus on place and space, which hopefully is going to have a good legacy. And again, some of our cities adapted more elegantly than others in the way that they incorporated cycle lanes and outdoor spaces. Some of them were really quite creative in how they designed the issues of space and distancing. Others, I've got to say, made a terrible mess. And it was a game of several different ways of doing it. But I think the whole notion of pandemic has been a game changer in how we think about that in future. It's not going away. And the idea also that pandemic has affected the property of our cities, in how, in the past, we've lost so many shops. That was happening anyway. So I think there's going to be another wave, which coincides with the wave of carbon and the importance of that in the environment. So I think we're going to see changes coming, which I'm very excited about, actually, because at last the architecture profession, about 2018, 2019, really woke up to their position in the future of our resources, as well as our energy and our carbon. So I think it's been a long time coming, and it's coming now, hopefully, and that we'll see different creative ways of repurposing and reusing buildings, and that sits with the idea of different ways of working, different ways of shopping, different ways of living, different ways of socializing. And it's been an interesting time. But as I say, I do stress this inequalities issue. I was heartbroken to be in Zoom meetings with people who were sitting at the end of their bed with their kids in the back room. It was really, really sad. And I think that is something that our politicians need to think about in terms of our social infrastructure, and designing a social infrastructure that works better. I mean, Scotland has some good practice in childcare, but that all went pear-shaped in the pandemic. And some of the images I might share show some of the potential of that. Mm-hmm. So it's a huge change. I've gone for rather too long on it.
That's okay. We're going to pick up on some of these points, Karen, so thank you. In terms of that equality agenda, can we think about greater diversity and inclusivity? How have you developed your practice? And you've said quite a lot already, I think, in your different ways and different areas of experience. How do you see that becoming yet more embedded? So this point is going to come back over and over, I think. How do we make that quality for everyone and not for the few? So anybody want to start us off on that one? And please you don't have to wait for me. You can just join in and have a discussion. So anybody want to start off? Sarah, maybe.
Yeah, I can. Nicole, why don't you go first? I think you're ready.
Plus, Nicole, you've got a women's-led business.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned that on my website calls us out as a woman-led studio, and there is real purpose to that. And the kind of, when I first started the studio, I sat down with one of my former bosses and was talking about how I wasn't sure if I would be able to make it, and I looked across the sea of industrial design studios that we have in San Francisco and in Silicon Valley and Bay Area, and they're predominantly all run by men. There was not a single like known and recognized studio that I or he could name that was run by a woman at that time. And Silicon Valley is kind of a huge hub for industrial design. It's like a large portion of the work of industrial design in the world happens here. So we have an industry that is really very male dominated. And beyond that, I mean, I just look back at my career, and so much of it, I was like the only woman in the room. With like major executive and VP levels, there was never a woman kind of, in those ranks. And oftentimes I was just kind of the one solo female designer that was presenting to a room, sometimes, 20, sometimes 30 or, more men, and myself being the only one. It was not something that I tried to pay much attention to, but or did not let that be a barrier. But I felt like it was something that was significant in my career. And I really, as I started to see more women come into the profession, and throughout my career, I saw myself like growing and becoming friends with the women peers around me. And then at the point when I started my studio, I also recognized that a lot of them had kind of dropped out or left the profession entirely. So it's not been a career path that's been really supportive for a lot of women to stay in the industry. And so I saw a lot of challenges there, but regardless, decided to take the leap and start my own studio. And at this kind of same moment that I started my studio, I also took over the reins of running a women in design organization in San Francisco, where we had pulled together hundreds of women industrial designers to really kind of help them throughout their career. So I started my studio, started getting my first clients, realizing clients really liked the diversity of the team that I was building. I'll say we hire men too. We try to bring people of all different backgrounds, and clients are really starting to appreciate that. At the same time, I was able to kind of set myself as a role model and create a great example, pull in other women that I knew that were still in the industry, and create events where they would come up and give talks. We would do panels. We created a mentorship program to really help build, more women's career paths, greater networking opportunities, and do whatever we could to bring more women into the field and help keep them there. Make sure that they find positions that were supportive for their life, and help them to, with whatever challenges they faced along the way. So I built my studio while kind of building this Women in Design program. After 4 years, I decided to hand over the reins as things were coming to play with the George Floyd incident and the Black Lives Matter movement. I actually looked around and realized that I had spent a lot of time focusing on bringing more women into this world, and I was really proud of the work I had done. But I also knew that beyond women, we had a greater challenge of bringing in more people of color, more people with different disabilities, more people from all different experiences. And so we have since about a year ago joined a diversity and design organization that's started by Herman Miller and Knoll organization in the US. So we've joined forces with them and are working kind of the greater BIPOC representation in the world of industrial design, and really happy to be able to commit our studio's time and energy into that. And we also connect with local high schools and little like STEAM organizations here to bring more awareness of industrial design to kind of sometimes underprivileged or schools, and the teenage years where people aren't necessarily getting exposure to knowing what industrial design is. So we're excited to kind of bring those programs to life too.
Thank you very much. That's a great story in terms of the evolution of your own studio. Karen or Sarah, would you like to come in on this point?
Well, I suppose that, again, thinking about diversity and inclusion in the built environment, it's really, again, as I mentioned, I started practicing when, community regeneration in urban areas was very much at the fore, and we developed, again, physical tools for involving people in their places, which mapping where mattered to people, their understanding where the stories were actually about places, and being aware as we actually were involved in building new parts of neighborhoods, that the heritage was as important to the community as the future, of new housing, and that was something that we then took to our work in the islands, where again, the heritage is much more implicit in the culture, but it's it's a fascinating part of place. I talked about concrete places. There's also there's the other aspect of places, which is the invisible ties that connect people to it. So again, it's about being aware when you're designing in a place that it's actually the people who know it and who will enrich it and who will make it a community. But I suppose that things that have become even more interesting as we move that was then, and this is the idea that this is now being embedded in policy and planning with local place plans, charrettes, and really getting people involved, but also moving into things like Scottish Civic Trust Heritage have they've been doing a queer mapping of places, and understanding places for different communities within cities, within other areas. But the whole the place that I know is not necessarily the same place that a refugee will know, and it's understanding that, because it's only through understanding that we can see where we're putting up barriers, or we're doing the wrong thing in our planning processes. And again, I think I'm hopeful that there is more understanding of that in the planning process, certainly in the investment in our places process. And that's something that, again, is moving on and getting better all the time. And I think it's important because, we often, I mean, you were talking about the kind of the maleness of product design. I do think that probably the property development is also a pretty male world, and as such, it's making sure that there's a counter to that in the system that that actually takes an account of these really important things, and again makes spaces that people can use that in this case actually don't have that money aspect. So again, a lot of that's happened in meanwhile places where a developer is not developing, so we have a community garden, but then something really strong happens in that space, and then ultimately, hopefully, it has more of a permanence, and the developer maybe will never develop. There's a few examples of that in Glasgow. So yeah, I'm probably straying away from the topic, but it's actually just getting everybody involved and realizing that places are means of exchange of skills across generations and across communities.
That's a great way to think about places, Karen. And maybe, Sarah, could I ask you to follow up on that, and by saying, well, if there are these multiple perspectives about place or product or property, in terms of the co-design process that you were talking about, how do you bring them in?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think one thing I just wanted to say on the back of what both have said, I mean, this is all about the diversity of your team, right? Like whoever's involved in the process, whether they're part of the team or you're bringing people in to add perspective to your team. And I think this is probably a whole other big conversation on the ethics, actually, of how we do that. And I'll come to that in a minute. But I think when I'm doing teaching now with sort of younger designers and thinking about what do I wish that someone had taught me when I was starting out, and Irene, I know you taught me, so this is no disrespect, I just realized that you taught me marginally for a small piece of it, but what do I wish Irene had taught me at the outset, or a book that I wish had existed when I was a younger designer. And that book is Design Justice by Sasha Constanza-Chock. I recommend that everybody reads it, because in that book, and Sasha herself sort of references that this is a collaborative co-design piece of work to develop a series of justice-led principles for the design industry. I'll just give you a flavor of some of them, and you'll kind of catch the drift really of how it kind of pans out. But one of them is that we use design to sustain, heal, and empower our communities, as well as seek liberation from exploitative and oppressive systems. Now, we all live in quite an oppressive system known as capitalism, but we do our best to try and make sure that we manage the outcomes of that system, the economic model of it, with nature and looking after the world. Other kind of principles in there. Another one that I've always really believed in is that we see the role of designer as facilitator rather than as expert. And I've always thoroughly believed that. And I don't know really where that came from, but when I was actually a young designer at the Glasgow School of Art, we did quite a few community projects, and I always felt that I shouldn't even really be there. But there was a role for the designer to kind of help people sometimes see things in a different perspective. Sometimes to, if we're designing a service together, really be an expert in exploding the materials that make up that service, but really giving people the tools in which to manipulate that and design that themselves with you. I think that's really your role. And when I talk about things like that, when I talk about exploding a service, what I mean is all the things that influence the user experience that somebody might be part of. So that might be the policy that sets the brief for the service that's going to exist, or it might be the underlying data model that's being used to power stuff that somebody sees on a screen. And when I think about doing that and kind of merging sort of design justice principles with co-design, it really is about bringing those two things together and a kind of diverse range of voices and people relevant to that topic. And so that you can kind of start to uncover and challenge things that really don't drive equality, right? That drive things like forms of sexism or racism or homophobia or transphobia, and all these things that really I don't think set us instead for an equal society. And that's things like challenging collaboratively together things like algorithms and data models that power our services. There's one really good example that I've used quite a lot, if you'll let me share that, which is from a French company called, I think it's pronounced IDEMIA, but basically they're an algorithmic model that scans people's faces. So this technology is used to do things like border control, probably quite naturally, passport stuff. And things like originally when IDEMIA was using this technology, their algorithms didn't see all faces equally and clearly together. So they basically were more likely to mix up Black women's faces than those of white women, or Black and white men. And, this was like really thoroughly sort of investigated by the FBI, and there's been lots of kind of sanctions put in place, and people are working on this stuff, and really great organizations like Algorithmic Justice League are challenging all these kinds of things. But you can't, as a white woman, would I have noticed that? Would I have seen that? If I was part of the development team, would I have known that? Maybe. I think I'm relatively informed, but actually I think we need a much wider team to be challenging that stuff and collaboratively together. So co-design for me, you really have to be on it about going beyond what your perspective is and what the perspective of your team only is, and bring people together to kind of bring in both the kind of justice side of this, but also the multiple perspective in doing that, and really work across all the things that are impacting or influencing the thing that you're trying to design. Because no product, I mean, Nicole can talk much more eloquently than I can, even though I was trained as an industrial designer, but I feel like I went more into the ethereal nature of services. But all products as well, they're all influenced by external factors. So we need to be challenging all of them from, I think, a justice perspective.
So could I just add to that, or ask a question and say, in terms then of, in Scotland, we're trying to build a well-being economy. And I'd like to focus on the word economy here. How could we apply everything that we've been talking about, which I think is a values-based design ethic, and we could talk about that at some length some other time, so we might follow some of this up. But how could we develop an economy that is based on these principles more than we've had till now. I think your work in all of your areas, as 3 female entrepreneurs, I might point out, is that you're practicing what you preach and you're actually doing it. So that's a good start. But how can we encourage others to do similar things, or things that are based on a set of values within the design sector, the creative practice sector itself, conceived of in its widest terms?
I think if I could just jump in, if that's okay, and hopefully going to answer it, because it's such a big question, Irene. So I feel like there's so many answers to it. I mean, when even just thinking about the term well-being economy, it always leads me, I guess, to think about what does good well-being even mean and look like? Well, let's just start there for a second. And so predominantly, when we think about who's there to serve our well-being, we often think about health services, and we think about treatment. So we think about giving medicine to somebody to solve the thing that's wrong with them. And when I think about well-being, I think much more about prevention and about the design of everything around us contributing to the prevention, which is about positive well-being, both physical but mental. And we know that poor physical health, impacts mental health, and vice versa. It's intrinsically linked in our bodies. So when I think about a well-being economy, and given I have a secondary role as being on the board of Loch Lomond and Trossachs National Park. So for those listening, hopefully most people know what that space is, but it's beautiful. It's one of 2 national parks, possibly one of few national parks in the future, which the government are very keen on implementing. And 50% of people in Scotland live within an hour of this incredible area. And we know there's a really great report from a company called Fields and Trust. It was called Revaluing Parks and Green Spaces. And they did some clever economic work, I would say, a well-being economics. And they said that if in health, parks and green spaces could save the NHS £111 million per year through prevented GP visits, because we know of the positive impact that access to green spaces allows us. So when I think about a well-being economy, I think about access to places like that. But that is also infrastructure. And we need to invest into that kind of infrastructure, because in places like the National Park, we have not only a climate crisis, but we have a nature crisis as well. We're losing species. Our water isn't as healthy as it should be. We're seeing things like blue and green algae on the shorelines. So a well-being economy to me is about really the government saying, we're going to invest money into the things that the everyday will keep well. And I know maybe I'm teeing up Karen for this, hopefully, in a sense of how we design our buildings and our places and our spaces, but really putting well-being principles at the heart of every single thing we're designing that's preventative, that is about justice, and it looks after people. It gives them a big cuddle. That's always what I think is my design principle. How do you cuddle people? So maybe, Karen, I don't know if you want to follow up on the kind of physical design, but that obviously impacts people's well-being, right?
Yep. Indeed. I mean, it's just interesting, I was looking at stats in that regard, and, the physical environment affects people's health something like half as much as clinical care. So that very much adds into preventative, and it sort of ties back into how we value our spaces, which ties into the idea that it's no longer good enough to build substandard housing that you demolish after 20 or 30 years, as has happened. You actually have to build housing that will last for its carbon content, but it will last because people love to be there, want to be there, and it provides them with the spaces that make them well. And I think the thing that, hopefully it's also homing in on some of the issues around just things like sun and light access, space and air quality, heating and, insulation, all of that, is fundamentally preventative, and it's about well-being. And so it's about, all designers, but in the built environment, kind of just turning the dial round to focus on the output as being quality. And unfortunately, in our housing, often it's just the money and the numbers, and we've got to really forget both, because what we build now, we have to build once for the future, so it's that whole agenda, and into that comes the green space, because again, as you mentioned in relation to the parks agenda, I've got another stat, which, sorry, I'm so slow, but I've got another stat about the impacts of green space. So she said, frantically looking through here. I'm so bad at getting my act together for this, but basically it's something like huge, like those who have no access to green space have been proved to have lower immunity to viruses. So again, just being out there, and that's where, issues around outdoor learning spaces in our schools increase the chances that the child will be outside getting vitamin D and not inside, at the screen. So all of that plays into it, absolutely.
Yeah. I also love thinking about how space impacts people. I don't know if anybody saw back in 2019 at the Milan Furniture Fair, Google had an exhibit that was a collaboration with Muto, the furniture company, where they built a few different spaces and then put on like a wristwatch that had some biosensors in it. And they were able to actually map out like each individual person's reaction to the different spaces that had different furniture, different colors and lighting and art on the walls and, objects in the space. And it's really interesting to see how there's just the science of kind of neuroaesthetics is really just starting to take foot. And you, with these kinds of sensors and EEG that people can wear on your head, we're actually really able to like understand the human brain and how it's actually reacting to the aesthetics and to the feeling in spaces. So we can actually kind of scientifically prove what's helping different types of people, and how we're actually able to be more calm. Our heart rate and different biomarkers will actually be better in different types of aesthetics aesthetic experiences. We've also started with a client to experiment a bit on this, on how we react to different textures and feelings. For industrial designers, we work a lot with materials and colors. This is such a huge part of what we do. It's so interesting to be able to be guided by like really understanding the insides of the human brain and how we interpret and process these different signals. So I'm really excited about that, but also, and I think that's a lot of talking about the preventative parts and what we as designers can help influence. But if we go back to even thinking through the pandemic, I think like a really tough thing that we have to tackle with, especially in the United States, is the access to healthcare and the access to childcare. Affordable childcare is just so out of reach for a tremendous amount of the population. I live in one of the most expensive cities in the world, and I can tell you people have to work their tails off just to be able to afford, somebody to watch your children. It's almost out of reach to have children in places like this, even with some, people that are college educated and have good paying jobs. It's people are stretched thin. Inflation is making things incredibly tough right now. Just the cost of food has gotten out of control. So I think when you talk about wellness is a great dream, but even just getting the basics is getting harder and harder these days. And I want to see what we can do to help the government, to help influence things, what we can do to make things more affordable and accessible to people, because it's quite painful. And the results is that we're dealing with a lot of people with depression and anxiety. And I think before we just talk about building these beautiful images of the future, I think there's some real issues that we need to tackle now to get people even to a state that's somewhat like healthy and livable.
I think that's where the, when it comes to economics, which is, the big, elephant in this room, it's how do you how do you value the things that can't be counted, i.e. well-being and health? And it's making the case for that significant cost in the public sector to bad design, be it places or services, and it's how they can be more empathetically designed and delivered, but also more effectively and efficiently, and therefore the economics coming back into it. And that's something that, the case for design is something that obviously occupies us all as designers, and it has to be really strongly made as much as we can.
Yeah, it's sometimes hard to convince the clients, the governments, various organizations that we work with, how important it is to spend the money upfront, because it looks like a really big dollar sign, multiple dollar signs, but that, years into the future, that's going to save so much money. It's really hard to see how those investments are going to pay off in the long term when it comes to, keeping people out of hospitals, when it comes to reducing our carbon footprint and impacting the earth in a way that we're not causing wildfires and people's homes aren't getting destroyed. That long-term view is just not always there. And I think we're really going to have to shift the mindset. And I really try to do that with our clients. And, speaking about the pandemic, I have learned to stand up more for what I believe in, and to, really fight a lot harder and just be more confident in those persuasions with clients to try to do what I can to get them to make the right decisions, looking at in the long-term distant future of like what's important and why we need to spend the money now, because spending that money now makes such an impact on the future.
So it's quite interesting that in our conversation, we kicked off, I think it was you, Sarah, that was saying we can do things fast. When we have to, we can move and we can do things fast. And that's been proved. So maybe there's a recipe in there about being able to act fast, but have a long-term view that you've been saying and Karen's been saying, that to be able to do both. I'd just like to ask you, we're getting to a point where we'll be rounding off. And I just wanted to ask you that I'm in education, and I wondered if you had some tips or some advice or something that you could say to our students and students of all institutions that are involved in creative practice about, if you were just to say kind of briefly one or two things, here's one or two things that you might care to think about. So I've already mentioned one, how do you design fast, but within a long-term view? Might be an example. So it's just something that we could think about in terms of even questions. So not solutions, but the right kind of questions would be good. So do you have some examples of that would fit that context of teaching and education and learning?
I would say I have been a teacher myself. I also work with the university that I went to, as well as others, to kind of advise on curriculum and how to kind of create the best portfolios to make students hireable. And I also do judge quite a number of design awards. So I see a lot of the student work and kind of how we're figuring out what the winners are. And like I'd say that the big overarching theme is how we make sure that designers are really thinking through a problem and solving something really deep and meaningful. Not just design for the sake of design or making a pretty object. That's just not enough and not going to cut it these days. You really need to be like solving a problem that humanity is facing, whether that's like reducing consumption, reducing our carbon footprint, helping people that are sick and, or with disabilities that are overlooked. There has to be really some like heart to what you're doing. There has to be something significant. And what we're looking for is the reason that the product should exist, and that you have really creative solutions that are actually not just causing more waste or not just adding to our landfill and our carbon footprint, but they're actually really going to make a difference to people's lives, and they do need to exist.
Yep.
Thank you very much, Karen.
Yeah, I always just say to, we as a profession, who have a big impact on resources, both in building and in maintaining and powering. I always say we need to be part of the answer and not part of the problem. And into exactly what Nicole has been saying, I would add the other side, which is I always say to my students, you need to evidence what you're doing. You need to be absolutely clear about the impacts and make the case. So, if you really are convinced that this building has to be of X, explain why, talk about the whole journey of the materials, the implications, what they'll be like in 50 years' time, etc., etc. So it's not sufficient to be architecture of aesthetics anymore, or it's about purpose, architecture of purpose, whatever that purpose is, be it social or be it sustainable. It's vital. And into that comes all the wonderful things about creating beautiful, lasting, loved spaces, because these are the spaces that will be sustained. But, it's the evidence and the beauty at the end of the day.
Thanks very much, Karen. Sarah?
Yeah, a few things. I think one, I said this at the outset, but look underneath the hood of what you're being asked to design or work on. Interrogate that brief. Look at the data that drives something, the policy that's in the background, the culture around it, all that sort of stuff I talk about is full stack service design, and make sure that kind of equitable principles are built into that. So, and you can start anywhere, because this stuff can feel really big and really overwhelming and like, oh my God, I'm working in a capitalist system. Like, how do I take on this oppressive system? But you can change very small things with what you're designing, or an organization you're designing with, whether it's about giving people just a bit more holiday who are designing the thing, or maybe it's about slightly tweaking the data that you capture to be more trans inclusive, for example, in a product or service. So you can do small things as a designer, even if the thing feels really big, to bake in more equitable stuff to the kind of layers of that thing. I think the second thing I'd say is, like, is your voice the right voice in the room and the right person to be representing that problem or solution? And even if you're playing, a very good facilitative role, you don't need to be the person always speaking. So how can you create a platform for other people to have their voice heard and really be a kind of like a good ally, I guess, and when you're designing? And I definitely believe that a lot in co-design work I've been part of at Snook, where we've taken a step back and the people we're actually designing with are presenting the work. We did a really beautiful, fantastic piece years ago called I Mind, which was with Scottish Government, NHS and Young Scot, designing kind of new youth mental health services. And it was all the young people who'd been working with us who presented it to the health minister. And it was just brilliant. They had to teach the health minister what a GIF was at the time, an animated GIF was, which was just brilliant, and better to come from them than myself. And I guess the final thing that I'm more switched on to these days, now that to be really frank, we've had data about the climate emergency and nature crisis for years, but I guess it's becoming more and more ever present in our lives, and more here and more real. And I really like the kind of I actually want to give credit to Ness Wright, who now works at Architecture and Design Scotland, but used to work with me at Snook, and she always talked about and introduced me to the idea of the 7th generation principle of stewardship. And that's really about thinking, it comes from the Iroquois people, so it's an indigenous sort of thinking, which we can probably learn a lot from before we went around and started spreading our wings across the globe. But it's this idea of looking 7 generations in the future, so about 520 or so years, and thinking, what am I doing now and how will it impact people in the future? And will that be a good thing and positive for their well-being? So 7th generation principle and stewardship, I think, is a nice way to think about what we do as designers now. Because we don't get it right now, there'll be no tomorrow.
So on that note, thank you. So I'd just like to round off. First of all, I'd like to say that was an absolute pleasure hearing what you had to say about these different points. So I'd like to thank Nicole and Sarah and Karen for participating. And I have to say, I think it all flowed along quite naturally because there was so much that I think we shared in terms of our perspective. So we were really opening up one of those gifts that you've been talking about, Sarah, as we went through this last period of time to explore things that I think we very much shared. So that's been great. So thanks to all the panelists. Thank you to all viewers of this event. And I hope that you've enjoyed it as much as I think we all have, and that it's been of benefit to you. I'm slightly inclined to invite Sarah and Nicole and Karen back for another session in some shape or form, because this is a conversation that could continue, obviously. And I'd like to thank XpoNorth, Highlands and Islands Enterprise, and the organisers of the event for the invitation for all of us to have this conversation today. So just to conclude, thanks again to everybody for your participation.
Thank you all. It was so nice to meet you. I wish we could meet in real life someday.
Yes, well, we'll be planning that, Nicole.
Okay.
We'll come to the campus.
Yeah, I'm up for a trip to Forest.
Yeah,
Exactly,
you're all very
yeah.
welcome to visit. Nicole, a bit longer for you, but you're very welcome. So this is what we'll do. Okay,
Great.
Thanks very much. We can close now.
Bye, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.